Hello everybody, my name is Tim, and not too good at the public speaking thing, so we'll try to go through it as best I can and hopefully not bore everybody. So basically this is going to be a story about speedcrafting, and I'll get into a little bit more details about what that all means and what I've been doing. So let's just go ahead. Basically going to try to answer a few questions that I've assumed that you might have. And I'm going to try to go through them. So I'm going to talk about who I am, who this talk is for, what the idea of speedcrafting is for, what is speedcrafting, why I do it and why you should do it, what I did, and how you can get started in doing it yourself, and then where you can go after that, like what the next step is. So first, who am I? Like I said, my name is Tim Hely. Here's my name. Here's a picture of me, sort of. So I've been working in 10 years as a programmer for a medical billing software company out in Baldwin. It is the boringest job in the world. Luckily, I have a lot of free time that can sneak into the day, so I get to do other stuff sometimes. I've made 14 games since 2009. 2 of them were major releases, I actually got paid money for. They're out on the internet to play. Basically, one was a sponsorship thing, the other one was just a collaboration with another company that I know that we put out together. 7 of them are game jam games. So I got started doing game jams a couple years ago, and I've been basically every one that's been in town. The last 7 of them, basically. I'm also, as of recently, a contributor to the Hexflixel project. I'll talk about that a little more later on. It's an open source game development framework that, because of some of the stuff I'm doing in the community there, that kind of added me to their official team. And I also write the Iconia webcomic, which is a weekly webcomic. It doesn't have much to do with gaming, but it's just something I do. So that is a picture of my first ever game, which is so far my favorite. But yeah, so that's what I do. So who's this for? Basically, speedcrafting. The idea is that anyone can do it. So newcomers to game development, this is a good way to get sort of their feet wet, to jump in and start doing stuff and trying to get some practice down. Also, if you're an individual or a small team who's already made games and made money off of them, or is a little more than hobbyist, you can kind of do this. To just kind of hone your craft with in between projects, or if you're kind of stalling on a big project, it's taking forever, stop, work on something small for a little bit, do some speedcrafting, maybe do better team building exercises if you've got a couple people that you're working with that way. Anyone who wants to get extra practice can do speedcrafting. Okay, so what is speedcrafting? And this is a term I think I stole from these guys because I think I saw them use it and I said, oh, that's basically what it is. My definition of it is making and releasing a finished game in a predefined short amount of time. And it's important that I mention that it's making and releasing a finished game, because I think a lot of people kind of think, oh, well, I do a prototype of this, I can do a game like this, or an idea and I get it built, but nobody ever sees it. It's the same thing, I made a game. I think that's a little bit of a difference. So the components to a speedcrafting game, that you have a time constraint. If you don't have limits, specifically with time, your projects will get out of hand very quickly. This happens all the time. Feature creep, or just stalling, where you say, I'll do that next week. It doesn't have to be done. I'll work on it next week, or I'll look into getting it done in a couple weeks. Putting a time constraint actually is what probably the biggest point of doing a speedcrafting project is all about. You want to put a constraint on it. It helps you plan for an end goal early and make sure you meet it. If you know on day 1 you've got 30 days or 45 days or 1 week before you're done, you know exactly the pieces start clicking in your head. I need to get this done, I need to get this done, I need to get this, and you can make a list, you can plan for it. If you don't plan early enough, then you're going to get to the last day and say, oh, I don't know how I'm going to even do this. I didn't know that was even going to be on there. So knowing your time constraint ahead of time and planning, basically if you do the whole thing almost in crunch mode, it makes it all a little bit easier, which seems like it should be the opposite. It's true, but it makes more sense to do it as a crunch game. Finishing is another big component to a Speedcrafting game, because you want to you don't want to just have a playable prototype, like I said. You want to have a finished game that you can show somebody and say, I made this in a week, or I made this in a month, or me and some friends made it in 6 weeks. It's a game that can sit down and someone can play and understand how to play it, and has all the components of maybe a bigger game, which is another point of the Speedcrafting, is that you kind of get a feel for how these other components that a prototype won't have. I'll go into more details on that too. You don't want to leave out important features if your game needs it, and again, if it doesn't need it, you can kind of skip it. But if you're doing an RPG type game, you want to have a save load option. You would have set options of sound, volume, full screen modes, or screen resolutions if you can put them in there. Achievements, don't leave them out because it's short, but plan ahead of them to make sure that they're in there so you can get a feel for how to use them. If you skip over some of these things, you're not getting any practice on using them, or seeing them in your finished product. Keep your list of goals reasonable. You might have 1,000 things you want to do, and on day 5, and you realize you're not going to get half of them done, start just throwing stuff away. Keep your list reasonable. It kind of goes against what I was saying. Make sure the core pieces are in your game. Don't leave things out that are important, but make sure that you can get the things you want to get in there as best you can. And the third component of a Speedcrafting game is releasing it. There's not really any point if you don't make a big bunch of noise when you release it. Say, I made this game in this much time. Spam on Twitter, Facebook, G+, everything, and say, here's this game I made. From my personal experience, just doing that for one game that I made in a month, I think I've doubled the amount of people who follow me in like 2 days with the first game I did for this kind of idea. It doesn't necessarily equate directly to money. I'll get into that later on, but making noise makes it so people can find you later on. When you say later on you're going to work on a bigger game, you say, here's some other games I made in a month. And people say, oh, look at all these. These are really neat. The noise that you make actually trickles down the line and helps you out later on. Game jams are a type of Speedcrafting, but they're a little bit different because they're kind of bent towards quickly getting a team together and quickly letting it everyone cooperate in the same project. Everybody has a voice. If you set your own goals, you can do a game jam style Speedcrafting project on your own, but it's going to be a little bit different. You're not going to be getting there to try to form a team with people you don't know. That feeling is a little bit different, but for a good entry point into how to make games, doing a game jam is a great way to get in. If you can't do that, or if you want to do stuff in between game jams, do it on your own with yourself or a small team. It's a different. You learn different things from either type of project. So why should you do it? And I kind of pointed this a little bit. It gives you good practice making games. I can't stress it enough. If you can make as many prototypes as you want, you can play with code behind the scenes. You can open up Game Maker and do platforms and collisions for years. But if you never actually go through the entire process of a game from start to finish, you may not understand everything you need to do when you go to make a real game. And what I see often, and it's happened to me, you have a great idea for a game, you have a prototype done, and then you're going to finish it, and it stalls, and months go by, and nothing ever gets done, and you abandon it. What could have been a good idea, or maybe wasn't a good idea, but could have been a better idea with a few tweaks, could be figured out by doing Speedcrafting projects around that idea. So, like anything, practice makes perfect, and by imposing these limits of doing this a short game in a short amount of time in bite-sized chunks, you get a better practice at the little pieces of things that you might not see otherwise just doing prototypes. You also get to see how gamification works, which is a big deal. You can take a game like Flappy Bird and understand when you try to make your own game that's a little bit different, you can sort of see the similarities and the differences and kind of understand what makes your game fun versus this other game, or what makes it not fun now that you've added these features or these things that you thought were fun. You can see what works and what doesn't work quickly. That's what these both say. You can overcome problems that you see early, again, if you're doing a small project, whereas if you're doing a year-long RPG type project, because those are huge, with a lot of writing and a lot of dialogue and a lot of maps, and you realize 6 months into the project that something doesn't work, and it would take a big overhaul of the system to the entire game. If you're doing these kind of projects as well, or on the side, that lets you see early on, well, that's not going to work, or this is going to work, but we have to do this to make it work. Again, it's more practice and more kind of understanding of mechanics and things. Again, this is what this is, seeing why they don't work. You also get experience in using polish features, which would be like, you know, adding a Twitter button that lets you tweet your high score, things that you won't do in a prototype. Putting in different kind of save or special effects or lens flared effects or whatever. Things where you might not really play with them in a real environment unless you're doing it. You say, oh, I'm going to spend the last week of my project doing this stuff. You know, I'm going to add polish, I'm going to add flare, I'm going to add fancy special effects and particle effects. And it gives you an opportunity to try new things because when your month is up or whenever your project's done, you're done with that one, you're moving on to the next project, and you're going to try something completely different. You can do the same, different iterations of the same game over and over again, but you probably shouldn't. You could. But ideally, you would want to make a platformer this time, make an RPG this time, make a strategy game this time, make a puzzle game this time, or mix and match. And again, you would want to do it to make the noise, to get noticed out there on Twitter, in the game dev communities. There's a lot of communities that, you know, if they see you tweet about your game that you made in a month, they'll retweet it a couple of different people, and people will come and look at it and say, oh, that's neat, and remember it later on when you do something bigger, hopefully. And again, it's always about learning new things. You can teach yourself a new language doing this a little bit, or look into new ideas. You know, maybe there's a plugin for something you never used before. This is a good way to try it out without actually committing to, I have to use this, and if it doesn't work, I don't know what to do. Why you shouldn't do it is kind of reverse. Don't do it to get fame. Hope that fame comes as a side effect of doing it, if that makes any sense. If you're doing it to become famous and become the next Notch or the Flappy Bird guy, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You should be doing it to hone your craft and hope that by doing that, people start to notice things that are good about what you're doing and jump on their bandwagon without you having to, you know, force it down their throat, so to speak. You also shouldn't do it for fortune, which is the same reason. You're doing it to make money. It's the wrong reason. You might make a couple bucks, depending. You might get lucky on the App Store, and 1,000 people download your game, but that shouldn't be your goal. It should be a nice bonus if it happens, and I don't think it happens very often. And that's just the way the industry is right now. You might make Flappy Bird 2 and make, you know, millions of dollars. You're probably not going to do that on your first 1 month game. You shouldn't do it for a job, if it makes sense. You should be doing it sort of to just build your portfolio, so that when you decide to go get a job, you're not saying, here's a game I made in a month, I'm done, give me a job. It's, here's a dozen things I figured out while doing a dozen different games, and here's my portfolio of things. What I was going to say, this isn't a direct path to getting into these 3 things, but hopefully they'll open up doors, which will open up other doors, which will open up, I got some of these things. Or, you know, my next big project makes all this money because I learned how to do tricks and things and make things work. Hopefully that makes sense. So here's a little bit about what I did for my, why I'm talking about all this for you guys. So, starting last September, there was a game jam. And between then and January, I had made a different game almost every month. So we had the game jam game. I released a game in October, which was it's called Space Chase, and it was a huge 2.5 year project. So it wasn't a speedcrafting game. So I released the game with the game jam in September. Another game I released in October. November/December, we did a game dev drunk duel. I don't know if I talked about these yet. So the game jam game we made was How to Find Love in Less Than 3 Minutes. I worked on Wes, but Wes is among people with that. Space Chase I released in the beginning of October. It was a big deal, and nobody cared. Big deal for me, nobody cared, which was kind of an eye-opener. We did the game dev drunk duel for a month with kind of the community where everyone had a month, a team of people had a month to make a game. And then we did the next game jam in January, the global game jam, and released that game. And so after that happened, I guess it was in February, I thought, why not do it every month? So I came up with an idea to do Tim's 1 game a month project, and I was actually kind of being prodded by Seth a little bit on the internet. I was whining about stuff, and his advice was just make games. So I thought, why not? Why can't I do, if I've made these games you know, 4 games in 4 months roughly. Why can't I actually sit down and plan to do that? Now, some of them are game jam games, or 3-day games, or 48-hour games. I thought, why, if I, you know, because I got a full-time job, I got a kid, I got bills to pay. But I figured if I had a month to do a game, I could actually get one done. So I thought, let's go for it. Let's try to do this entire year, do a different game every month. So I plan to do one game every month and release it as if it was a full project every month. So at the end of the month, I was going to spam everything about it. I was going to tell people about it. Throughout the month, I was going to show people where it was. I'd have a website for each game. I'd have, you know, analytics and ads and all the fancy stuff that goes with a project, you know, a game release. Even though they were going to be relatively small when they were finished in scope, I still wanted to actually go through all the steps over and over and over again of a full game with website and everything. So has it worked out? Well, this is the first game I did. This was in February. This is so I released this at the very end of February. Called Meat Bags, and the idea for the game was that the original idea for the game was that you would have to corral these like sheep-like animals in this pen and keep them safe. Throughout the course of the month, that game's design changed a lot very quickly, which was part of the hope for this whole idea. Was probably between in like a 4-day span, the game went through like 4 different iterations of what it was. Just because of playing it, I'd see, oh, this doesn't work. I'd play it again, oh, this doesn't work, or this kind of works, and again, just iterating quickly. I was able to get this game to be completed. Got it out on Android, got it out on the web, and actually had a little bit of interest in it, and you know, no money off of it, but people were interested in actually looking at it and talking about it, and you know, talked about it on Twitter. Got a whole bunch of followers doing it. So I kept going. I did the next game. This was in March. Dinosaur Ghost Rampage. I tried to do something entirely different. So this game was all about you're a ghost dinosaur, and you're just supposed to tear through a city and tear all the buildings down as fast as you can while stuff's shooting at you the entire time. So whereas the first game was sort of a mitigate your losses game, you gotta keep things safe, this game was like the opposite. And it kind of came out of comments about the first game. The first game was like, oh, you know, I wish I could just eat all these things real quick. So the second game was kind of the opposite. You're going to destroy stuff as fast as you can and keep destroying stuff until you can't, you run out of time or whatever. This game I did a Flash version and a Windows version that actually had gamepad support, which was a whole new thing to me. And again, people notice it. This is probably my favorite one out of all of them so far. And then for the April Game Jam, I did this game, you know, a 40-hour game, where it's more of a story game about space, about a ship and their crew going to space, going to Mars, and it's a 5-player story-based game where every player gets a role on the ship, and then throughout the course of 12 weeks, they each get a different option. You know, the story event happens, and each person gets to pick a different thing that happens based on what their role is. Entirely different from the other 2 games. Again, trying to be different. I made it very laid back. There's no time limits. It's just something pops up on the screen, tells you what happens. You pick an option, and kind of move on from there. In 48 hours, the biggest problem was assets. Again, it's a big problem. You don't have enough time. Don't have people to do art for you. It kind of falls apart. That was the 3rd game. And so then for May, the last month, I just finished yesterday. I should mention this first. So each of those other 3 games and the 2 Game Jam game, or the Drunk Duel game and the Game Jam game, were all done using Hex Footstool, which is the framework that I'm kind of helping build now. It's an open source, open cross-platform game development framework using Hex as like the base for it, and kind of based off of the Footstool framework that Adam Atomic made for Cannibal back in like 2008, 2009. So if you guys want to know more about this, I can talk to you about it forever. But I got a little flyer that I did up too if you want to learn how to do it. This is one of the best things I think anyone wanting to make games can use. It's completely free. You don't have to pay any money to anybody if you ever use it. Oops. I'll go into that in a minute. Back. Yeah. So every game that I made is cross-platform in some degree. I think there's some tweaks I have to do to some of them if I want to do Android, which I could. Finding the right tool is kind of key, and I'll get into that a little bit later on too. And this is a good one if you don't know what you're doing at all. If you've heard about like Game Maker or Unity, or if you haven't any idea what you're doing yet, or you want to try something new, this is where you should go. And I'll talk to you about that later if you guys want to hear about it. So this last month, instead of just doing a game, I did this relatively simple game, which is sort of a top-down dungeon crawler game. But I built it as a tutorial to using Hexflixel. It's a lot of sections. There's like 13 sections of the thing. It goes from getting your Hello World to work, installing Hexflixel, installing stuff, and then it takes you all the way through doing a map editor, animations, sprites, and it shows you how to make an Android build for it, a Windows build for it, a Flash build for it, and adding music and sounds and all that stuff. And this was, again, because as part of the Hexflixel community, none of people knew about it, none of people were using it. They would come and look at it and say, oh, there's some source code, but nothing really doing anything. So I think I kind of cheated on this, but it did take an entire month to make this tutorial because it's that big, and it's up on their website. So again, I can give out flyers if you guys want to know more about it. So that's this last game. So how do you go about getting started in doing this? First off, you got to define your goals. You got to set your limits. You got to choose your medium. You're going to do a video game. If you are, what are you going to code it in? Hexflixel or something else, some other thing. Who cares? You're going to do a tabletop game, which is totally valid. RPG or card game. There's no reason why this couldn't be done in a speedcrafting environment. In fact, that might be even better for some of those games if you can sit down and say, hey, I got a deck of regular playing cards. Let's pretend that the ace is this and the king is this, and then try out a new game in a day. And by the end of the day, you have something that's finished. And then you just make the game. So real quickly, when you define your goals, again, like I talked at the beginning, try to be reasonable. And I think if you're the very first time you ever try to do this, you're gonna get to a point where you're like, I didn't get to do anything I wanted to do because I had to leave it all out. But if you get in the practice of defining your goals for this kind of project, if you go to do a big project for a big company and they're paying you money, you can have an easier time defining your goals for that, and not waste everyone's time or not promise the world and not be able to deliver. So it's a good practice to get into for any kind of work you're doing that's contract or all, creative type at all. If you know your limits ahead of time, it makes everything easier. Then the very most important step is to finish the game. And again, like I said, even if you have to break your rules a little bit and you say, well, I was going to do it in a month and it took an extra week because I had a problem with this, be honest about it. But if you can finish it in an extra week as opposed to just abandoning it, go for it. I mean, no one's making the rules. There's no rules. The idea is that if you set your goals ahead of time and you understand why you couldn't hit those goals in those time limits, having a finished game that you worked on for a month plus a week is better than having nothing at all. But you want to be finished, and you want to try to aim for being finished on time as best you can, because it builds that structure for later on. Promote the crap out of it when you're done. Tell everybody about it. Get up here and talk to everybody about it. Make a Google slideshow about it. It doesn't matter. Tell people about it. Go to the Science Center on First Friday and demo it. Doesn't matter. If people know about it, they kind of talk about it if it's good enough, and if it's not good enough, you can kind of judge their reaction. The more people are like, oh, well, I don't care, and hopefully make your next project even better and make it more spectacular. So where do you go next if you're trying to do this? And I got to stress that you should do your homework at a time. Don't jump into this going to say, I'm going to learn Unity today and then do a week-long project in Unity. Probably not going to happen. Get some practice with tutorials or videos or things ahead of time. Watch it. Do a little bit of prototyping beforehand, and then say, if you're brand new to game making or game development, get you and a buddy and say, you want to do this with me? We're going to spend 6 weeks and we're going to make a game in Unity, and I think I know what I'm doing. But don't jump into it blind. game jams are notorious for the guy shows up, they have no idea what they're doing, they get on a team, and they're like, well, we don't have any programmers. I kind of used this a long time ago, maybe I can try to do that for a game, and it never really works great. Be ready ahead of time before you get into this, because it helps in the long run. So Speedcrafting is the place to experiment and broaden your knowledge. It's not so much learning language, although you can try it. Again, if you're going to learn Hexflixel, which I suggest, again, learn about it beforehand, maybe a couple weeks, and if you're going to say, I'm going to start, the month of July, I'm going to make a game in July. Spend the 3 to 4 weeks before that getting ready for that, getting your mind to understand how the code works. Because you will not be happy at the end of July and when you have nothing done, because it just was too over your head at the time. If you know a language already, if you're already fluent in Unity or GameMaker or something, or C++ or whatever, start there. Make your first game something you know, because again, you're kind of you're not trying to learn a new language all the time. You're trying to kind of understand how the finishing pieces go. It's like doing a puzzle. It's easy to get the border pieces in place, and then you might give up on the middle because everything looks the same. If you want to focus on getting the middle pieces right as much as you can, so that when you go to do it for real, it comes more natural. And what is this? Oh. Games. So I'm going to hand the floor over to these guys, and then. You
want to do a Q&A first, or should we do it?
Yeah, I can do that. If anyone has any questions for me, yeah. What do you got?
Did you go outside of your, or did you see the deadline coming and you knew you weren't going to make it on the games, so you just cut out parts? Or did you pretty much get everything done you wanted to?
So the only time I had problems with time limits was, and I meant to mention this and I forgot to. For most of the projects, since I don't do any art at all, I'm terrible at art and music, I had some friends that helped me do some artwork, some sprites. So my friend Vicky did most of the artwork, like the little sprites for everything. My friend Patrick, who is part of the Fat Bard music team company, did all the music for free. Basically said, here, if you're doing this as a project, here's some music for you, which was great because I could rely on him. But the only time problems I ever ran into this entire experiment so far has been the last day. Hey Vicky, you said you were gonna do art for me. Where's it at? And I was, oh yeah, we got busy. And she throws something together, and I might have to wait an extra day. But I mostly kind of hid that fact by saying, oh yeah, I'll be done by the end of the month, and not saying a specific date, and then maybe it's a day or two late, and say, oh yeah, it's done. It was a month. Why not? Again, nobody's making the rules. I'm making all the rules. I can do what I want. That's why for May I did a tutorial, which is more writing and reading than anyone I think would like to see usually, but it's not just a game, so I didn't really have too many problems with time. Any other questions or comments?
Should we use Hexaflixel or?
Yes. In fact, if you have GameMaker, just uninstall.
All right.
What's the big difference between Flixel? I don't use Flixel a lot. What's the difference between Flixel and then Hexflixel? Are they both ActionScript?
So Flixel was ActionScript and was Flash only.
Okay.
And Adam kind of got busy with life and having kids and all this stuff, so he stopped working on it. I kind of said, hey, community people, just take my code, do whatever you want with it. So out of that, Hex was already a language that it already existed, but it was real kind of archaic. It was more like a C++ language or something. But it offered open source, or I'm sorry, not open source. It opened cross-platform stuff, and so this other guy made a thing called OpenFL, which kind of bridged the gap between Hex and Flash. So basically, in the long run, people said you can write ActionScript code that works in Hex and exports any platform you want. And somebody else said, why don't we use Flixel to do that? We can make a Flixel version, and that kind of grew out of that. So it's not quite the same. There's a lot of differences now. There's a lot of like core similarities, but it's grown so much now that it's way different. It offers a lot more power. It's a lot quicker. It's a lot more stable. It offers things like gamepad support. save files and things that Flash doesn't allow for security reasons or whatever. You know, it offers a lot more freedom. Security. Yeah. Tell you how hard it is to make it so you can save a file on other servers. Yeah. So I love it, and I don't think I'll ever change for quite a while. So, any other questions?
So
or anything?
is the language similar to ActionScript?
It's very, very similar to ActionScript. There's a little bit of differences. There's a few variables that are named differently, and there's a few extra things you can do that are amazing. I mean, to go into it now would be really complicated. But you could read a tutorial that I wrote and we'll just walk you through all this stuff. So, and again, I got these flyers if anyone wants to maybe pass them out.
Tracks, religious tracks.
Huh? So I'm gonna pass them out, and if you want to take one, I don't know how the best way to get those out to people.
Take one or Tim will hunt you down.
Just nail them to your door. So, all right. Anything else, or I'll let these guys talk?
Cool. Thanks, Tim. That was. That was really solid.
I feel like we can be largely redundant.
So we're done. We're Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth.
I'm Sam.
That's Sam, and we are a local two-man game studio. And this is our creds. These are 17 of the games that we've made quickly over the past year and a half or so. The ones that are highlighted are ones that we have published in some capacity. Quadrupus Rampage was actually made for the 7-day roguelike challenge, and then we fleshed it out over an additional 9 weeks, and then launched the version that you possibly know. Otherwise, the 8-hour ones were made for what we call the B-Scotch Jam, which is where we made 5 games in 5 days, back to back, which was a mistake, so we'll talk about that. And the 10-hour ones were what we did for our Speedcrafting, which is where we made 5 games in 5 weeks. And the 48-hour ones were for game jams. So let's get started.
So I think the first question to ask, and Tim addressed this already a bit, was the question of who. Who should be making games really, really fast? And what we found actually is as we've made more games, so like I said, we've done 17 game jam style games. As we've done more jamming, the marginal benefit for doing jams has started to kind of decrease a bit. And what we've seen is that actually jams are the best thing ever for learning how to do things, period. Like, you essentially get a month worth of growth in about 2 days or 5 days or however long you're taking to do something. And so really people who should be jamming are people who really want to get better at their craft really, really quickly. And on top of that, Tim mentioned people who are in the process of making a really big game. We took a break from Crashlands to make the Speedcrafting games that we did. And that was huge for us because you get kind of productivity high off of making a game. And that kind of pulled through eventually. It also helped a lot to kind of restore our energy, so it gives you something else to work on at the time. So there's also going to be people who should not make games really quickly. They're not necessarily going to be things that are making money, right? So if you look at this from a business angle, as Tim suggested, it's more for learning. And if you're trying to make money off it, frankly, it's probably not going to happen too much. So you might make what we call sandwich money, which a few bucks here and there to get a sandwich. But besides that, you're probably going to make money. So,
well, I guess what we would say, what we would advocate for is if you haven't done this before, then you should. Because you will learn a lot from it. Even if you've made tons of really big games, making lots of small games is just fantastic. So, well, that's great if you fall into the category of who should do it, but why should you do it? Well, we got a little acronym that we call SUDOBU.
super memorable.
It's not a thing. I don't know. We made it up. So anyway, let's go through SUDOBU. Okay. So the first thing you need to do, the first reason why you would make games fast is because it strengthens your design chops. What we mean by that is basically, you may think that a great way to become a better game designer is to design a lot of games. That's actually not true because designing a game doesn't give you the full experience. You have to actually create that game and be a part of its execution and see all the mechanics through to the end and see how they all fit together in action, because what works on paper in a game design doesn't always work out in reality. So by actually producing games really quickly, you're going to gain a much better intuitive understanding of how mechanics work together, and it's going to make you much faster and better in the long run. So,
The deep part of SUDOBU. is discover and explore ideas, which, of course, this is one of the things that's touted, right, by the game jams. It's like, okay, just come, you got 2 days, it's no sort of risk involved, make whatever crazy thing you can. For Seth and I, what this means usually, since we make games every day, we usually get to make multiplayer stuff for the game jams, which we can't really do because we're on phones right now. And so since we get to do this in game jams, we get to go and kind of play and explore and figure out some other mechanics that might work in an interesting cooperative context. And what this gives us for later is, again, a sort of backlog of expertise in the cooperative gaming sphere once we get to the point where we can actually execute on that in a sort of business and platform sense.
The middle U of SUDOBU is understanding distractions, or namely understanding how they work. There is a principle of productivity called Parkinson's Law. This is not the Parkinson associated with the medical disorder. This is a totally different guy. And his law simply states that the amount of time that it will take you to do something is equal to the amount of time that you gave yourself to do that thing. So if you decide, hey, I'm going to make and publish a game in 10 hours, guess what? You're probably going to do it. It may not be the best, but it's going to happen. And similarly, you know, for those of you who have done your first ever game jam, you probably walked away from that thinking, my God, I cannot believe that I made a game in 48 hours. It's miraculous. But the fact is, if you just give yourself 48 hours to make a game, you're going to make a game in 48 hours. So when it comes down to understanding distractions, distractions are what happen when you've given yourself dramatically too much time to complete a project. This is when you'll be coding or doing art or something, and you're watching Netflix on the side, or listening to Netflix on the side, browsing Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, you know, you're checking your text, you're returning phone calls all day. That means that you haven't constrained your time enough. So if you bring those constraints down, then you will be dramatically less distracted.
This is very important.
Thanks to George Lippert for this inspiration.
We talked about building up emotional scars. Making games is really hard, and then you put it out there, and the internet is the internet. It tends to be very mean about whatever it is that you made. We've all experienced this to some degree, but the benefit of making games really, really fast is twofold. One is that you get a volume of work behind you, which means that you have essentially a lot of products to distribute all of that angst against, right? You don't have all your eggs in one basket. You haven't spent 10 years making one game that some troll just decided to hate on, right? You have 50 games you made in 2 years, whatever. There's a hater, it's okay. And the other benefit is simply the fact that you get used to getting feedback, actually. Feedback is a huge part of what we do. We just last week actually ripped out the UI on one kind of whim of one of our playtesters and completely redid everything we've been doing in the past 7 months or so on Crashlands. And part of that is the fact that we've made game jam games. We've sat down with people and played and seen them, just silently watched them struggle desperately with the things we've made. And we've learned a lot in that process. So building games really, really fast gives you more opportunities to watch that struggle, learn from it, and then eventually, in the end, hopefully patch that stuff in before you actually launch.
And when it comes to interpreting feedback and taking feedback from your players, you have to be really careful about this thing called priming, which is basically if you've made a game that you think is great or that you're really pumped about, and you have somebody play it, don't tell them how great it is. Don't try to convince them that it's going to be fun. Just watch them and actually see if they're having fun, because otherwise you're going to get a false interpretation of what the game is really about. And it's easy to want to prime your players because it dampens the blow when they don't like it, but you gotta take the blow so that you can get these emotional scars that allow you to become a better game developer. The last U of SUDOBU is unlearning self-handicapping. Self-handicapping is a dangerous thing that we creative types like to do when we aren't too certain about whether or not the thing we made is very good. And this comes back to the emotional scarring idea, which is basically, if we don't feel like we want somebody to tear apart the thing that we made on the internet, then we'll have a tendency to undersell it. We won't finish it as good as it could be, or when we launch it, we won't say anything about it. Just put it out there, right? Don't put a main menu screen, don't put any leaderboards, just release an unfinished product silently. What that allows you to do then as a developer is point to all these things you didn't do and blame those for the reason that your game didn't succeed, rather than take the blame yourself. If you really, really tried and it still failed, it hurts, but if you have reasons why it failed, it doesn't hurt as much. So by making lots of games really quickly, you can experiment with, like as Tim was saying, you have to be loud about it, try to make a finished game, polish it up, put all the features in, and that allows you to you know, get all that out there and learn how to really advocate for your games and get much better at your craft. And it will allow you to sort of remove these self-handicapping behaviors that we use to protect ourselves as creators.
Now, the next question is how. Seth and I debated for a long time about the sort of structure of this particular set of slides. Because
Right,
we want kind of like a go-to guide.
Yeah, so here's what we came up with on how you should make one of these games. So first you're going to start, and then once you're done starting, you can execute making it, and then it's done.
But you know, we realize this might be a little high level.
So we're gonna break it. We're gonna go and
Dig in. Yeah. And first things first. You know, get some healthy snacks, guys. You gotta take care of your body.
surround yourself with carrots.
Your brain is a part of your body. If you got Twix brains doesn't make good games.
You shut your hole, Sam.
You gotta phone those donuts. Just get that out. You know, you gotta have good brain juice going. And if you can't, you know, keep on keeping on, you got a hard time. The next thing to do, after you've got carrots next to you, is determine the scope of your game. This is incredibly important. We found from doing our speedcrafting sessions and doing that 5-day game spree, there are certain genres that require a certain amount of content, a certain number of systems to work before they're actually even fun. So if you're talking like a 4X game, it's like Civ 5, you know, you're not going to build Civ 5 in 2 days. I don't care who you are, it's just not going to happen. It requires too much content and too many systems before it actually becomes alive, right? So what we found is that speedcrafting and jamming just being essentially making a game in 2 days, are actually genre restricted because of the time. So things that are kind of skill oriented, action games, platform games, arcade style games, those are actually going to be kind of your bread and butter in this case because they're easier to execute. The mechanic is easier to make fun within just a couple of hours, right? And the sub point here is something I think Tim was actually getting at, which is called nudging the envelope. You gotta push that envelope, just nudge it. If you're making a lot of games really, really fast, enough of those nudges will end up being way better than a big push. And when you push, you're essentially risking overextending your boundaries. And what I mean by that is, you know, I make art, for example. I don't make background or environmental art very often or very well. So what I might do is when we go into a game jam, we say, okay, let's make some arcade space shooter. And you know what? I want to actually try making my background art better. So for the first 4 hours of this jam, for 10% of this time, I'm just going to do that. That's just my thing, and I want to practice that particular part of my craft. And then everything else you use is essentially what you're used to doing, right? It's kind of more technical practice, more on the minutiae of, say, character art or whatever else. It's things that you're familiar with. But if you nudge the envelope enough, then you eventually kind of build up these skills over time that you can pull through in the multiple game jams and the bigger projects that you're working on. The last part, and perhaps the most important part, especially when you're working with a team, is establishing vision. And the easiest way to do this is to condense your game into one sentence. You're making it in 2 days. If you can't tell me what it is in a sentence, you're not going to get it done in 2 days. So, for example, a fast-paced action roguelike would be something like
Quite Rampage.
A game where you shoot animals out of your face, Talfight. A game where you slap your slices together, Bread Brothers, this was a while ago. And when you fly a rocket through a cave is Flop Rocket, right? So we basically figured out if you can condense it to one sentence, not only does it help you in terms of communicating it to your team, or when you present it at the end, but it's also a really good decision heuristic. A heuristic being kind of a shortcut for managing things. So when I say this game is about, it's a fast-paced action roguelike, if Seth starts saying, you know what, we should put this thing in after every level where the player takes a minute to like choose between 2 traits. We actually did this, by the way, earlier in Quadrupus. We can make the decision and say, okay, it's not fast-paced.
It's too slow.
We have to halt the player every stage for a minute. That's just not in our design docket. We're not doing it. And so that way you can speed up the rate at which you iterate, right?
All right, now, for the execution side of things, we have a different acronym, which happens to be similar to an acronym that we're already familiar with, but it's IGDA-J. So, let's talk about this. How do you execute on a quickly created game? The #1 rule is to iterate, don't design. One thing that we've kind of noticed is that whenever we go to a game jam, we are done with the core prototype of the game within the first few hours. Whereas most teams are still designing their game by that point and with another 3 to 4 hours to go on their design discussions. Every minute you spend designing your game bloats the game's features, and it increases your scope to a point where the game is no longer able to be executed. What you need to do in a speedcrafting or a game jamming kind of environment is, as soon as you have some idea of what the game should feel like to play and what the core gameplay mechanic is, build it. Stop talking about it and just make it happen. You may be done with your initial design discussion in 3 minutes, and that's totally fine because you'll have a prototype within a half hour. From that point, then, you can start seeing what works and what doesn't work, start adding features, tweaking things, and just try to make it more fun.
Now, the next piece, it might be shocking, but the reality is that basically nobody cares about a lot of the tinier things that you're doing. So you really just need to follow the rule of good enough. What I mean by this is, just as an example, all of the shading in our games is done from various pointed light sources. So you look at any of the characters like next to each other, their light sources are not going to match. This guy's going to have shadows on this side of his body. The guy next to him will have shadows on this side, and the guy over here will have light coming from the bottom. Right? I just put shadows. For no reason. I just put shadows on stuff, and then we go because I don't have time to figure out where all the light sources go. And basically, what it is that it still has to be good, right? So if I put shadows on one thing, I have to put shadows on everything. It'd be consistent, but it's got to be good enough. You know, if we start flipping stuff around on the screen, so if a character's going this way, I don't like to draw things more than once. Right? So if you'll notice in all of our games, all of the enemies and stuff stand at about this angle because it lets us move them up and down and left and then flip them over here to make them go right. So we only have to do all of the animations once. You don't have to worry about, if they do some really sick flip in the air, you don't have to draw it from this perspective and that perspective and that one as they're flipping, right? So it allows you to remove a lot of work if you just sort of follow this structure. And the reality is, again, that most players are actually not going to notice. As long as you're consistent, people don't really notice a lot of the differences. So what I mean by consistent is don't use a realistic photo for your background, and then clip art for your foreground, and then a vector piece for your character, right? So at that point, you have so many styles mismatching that people are going to be a little thrown off by what's going on the screen. But if you keep everything within the same kind of genre or same feel, then you're really able to carry this pretty far.
And kind of moving on from that, we have the don't repeat your work rule. And this kind of falls in line with the good enough thing because you actually don't need to do a whole lot in order to make a really good game. As an example, our running frames are always our running animations in our games are always 2 frames. Some people make 30-frame walk cycles, we just use 2, and nobody notices. The enemies in Quadrupus Rampage all have 4 frames of animation, and it works fine. And we even just recolored them to make special versions of the enemies, change their sizes. All of a sudden, we've got tons of different enemies. So this falls right into the don't repeat your work. Rather than making a whole slew of new enemies, we recolored the existing enemies and made them more rare. Now all of a sudden, they're special and scary. We also used a resizing thing, so we have some enemies that are bigger than others and they have more health, and that makes them scarier, and and it works out. But along this same vein, I guess the golden rule would come be just don't reinvent the wheel. If you can find a wheel lying around, then just use that. Right. Don't write your own engine. If you find an existing framework that works, then use that. If you're making a game in C++, it's going to take you a lot longer. This also applies to just your general code. The more games you make, like if you speedcraft a bunch of games really fast, you're going to start building up code libraries that allow you to manage your projects much more easily. So when we made Torso Demon Saga this January, we used the tile management code from Quadrupus Rampage. We just brought it over, and now all of a sudden we could focus on the game mechanic instead of trying to figure out how do we remake a tile management system. So just keep reusing stuff as much as you possibly can.
And this one is interesting because I think a lot of people don't really have a vocabulary for what happens here. And the reality is your brain is a decision-making machine, right? But your brain uses a lot of energy. And the reality is that you essentially have this sort of finite set of the number of decisions you can make in a day. So every time you have to make a decision about what do I buy today, or if you're making a game, what color do I make this, how big is this thing, you're kind of taking one of those out. So what we've done with a lot of stuff is we actually try to avoid thinking about things as much as possible by use of heuristics that have been cleverly planned beforehand, right? So in this example, you do all your thinking in that first starting phase, and then once you're actually doing, you try to just be doing, right? So one very good example of this that came from the speedcrafting sessions is that I had never used a color palette before in my life. The Inkscape has this bar at the bottom, And I'd just be like, looks good, and then that would be it. The problem is that looks good actually cost me, right? I had to make a decision about what color something was, what color its shadow was or highlight was. And every single time I did that, I got a little tired. So what we found is that the speed crafting sessions, by noon or so, I was just wiped out. I made like 40 assets and I'm just tired and need to go to bed. What we did then is we grabbed a color palette. So a color palette I would just get from cooler.adobe.com, it's K-U-L-E-R. Pick a color palette I really like, do a snip of it, put that snip inside of Inkscape and then just drop from it, and make the entire game within that color palette. The reason being, one, it makes the game look really consistent, again, really, really nice, and then also it removes all that decision overhead. So the first game we used this with was actually Flop Rocket, which by far was the most kind of productive game we actually had during that time span. I worked the entire time as opposed to having to go take a nap for like 2 hours.
It only has 5 colors, so there you go. And the final part of IGDA, or whatever this acronym is juice as you go. So we are big advocates of juice. For those of you who haven't heard us touting about or yelling about it, juice is basically making everything in your game feel really good. So when you tap a button, does that button do nothing, or does it bounce and make an explosion and squirt things? I don't know. But anyway, camera shake, explosions, particles, screen flash, lens flares, anything that you can add that just makes the world feel more alive and active and interactive and interesting, that's juice. So our rule is don't juice everything last, because all you're doing then is you're creating just a whole bunch of unfinished things that are going to sit there in your mind as being unfinished, and it's going to add to your kind of stress about the project. Finish everything as you go, and that includes juicing. So if you make something and you think, wow, it'd be nice if this exploded, which is always something that you should be thinking, then just make it explode. If something needs to shoot blood, make the blood. Just do whatever you need to get that juice in right away.
There's one thing we actually found out early called the blinking rule. Blinks are very easy to execute. You do an overlay, same boundary box.
Blinking of eyes.
Blinking of the eyes. Yeah. If you make everything blink in the game, take your artist an extra 5 minutes per asset, maybe when they first start. It really just makes the game world start kind of livening up for some reason, because the things aren't just standing there staring out into space.
It's like they're deliberately standing there staring out into space. They're blinking. So.
And again, as Tim suggested very strongly, and we are going to harp on as well, finish the game. Whatever that means in that particular game's context. It's not going to be the best because you're speed crafting it, right? But it needs to have a menu screen. It needs to have, say, the Twitter hook-ins, Facebook integration, maybe if that's a thing you're playing with, achievements. Publish the thing, especially if you're doing speed crafting. Make it so that you can give it to someone and they can play it and you can watch them react to the entire game. Right? And the reason you do that is, of course, you can actually start getting good feedback about your design, about your process, and everything else.
And this also means that if someone were to play it and you weren't there, that they would be able to play it. So this even includes tutorials or a little instruction list or whatever it is that you need in order to allow any player anywhere in the world to pick up your game and play it. That would fall under this. All right, so we've now talked about SUDOBU, and we've talked about how to execute your game and how to put all this together. But even just if you're making games quickly, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to actually gain a lot from it. There's one final piece of the puzzle, and that basically comes down to thoughtfulness, namely doing postmortems. What we found is that by making games more spread out, we were able to think more about it, and it allowed us to improve our craft in the long run. So there are a couple things that you could do in order to get a lot out of a postmortem. One is make it public. So kind of like what Tim just did, even though he doesn't like public speaking, as he said, he still stood up here in front of 50 people and did it. Because by making it public, you make a commitment that you are going to take the time to do this postmortem right, and you're going to make it useful for people. So if you just write it up for yourself in your own personal diary, your journal or whatever, then you might phone it in. You may just kind of, oh yeah, I did a postmortem. I just wrote a couple paragraphs. If you make it public, then you're making a commitment to people that you're going to do it. So write it up on a blog post and link it on the Facebook IGDA page or the Game Dev Meetup group or whatever. Put it out there and try to make it useful for people. And this is kind of contrary to everything else that you're ever told everywhere in life. But focus on the negative things. Because the positive sides of like what went well about your game, it's nice and it makes you feel good and it feeds into your ego, but that's not useful in the long run. What you really need to be focusing on is, all right, what did I screw up? Did I misplan something? Did I miscalculate how long this thing would take? Was my design too big? Was my design too small? You know, whatever it is that that kind of sunk your game or that was a big failure point for your game, try to figure out honestly why that happened so that you can improve, and then the next game you can avoid making that same mistake.
So really, the interesting thing is we had a kind of a microcosm of this with the Butterscotch Jam, which is that 5 games in 5 days thing, and the Speedcrafting sessions, which was 5 games in 5 days. They were on Mondays. They were only on Mondays, and we did them over the course of 5 weeks, right? So these games took about 8 hours to make. These ones took 10 with publishing. But the interesting thing is that because these ones are so smashed together, we gave ourselves 0 time to actually think about what we were doing, to figure out where the holes in our process might be, where we could speed stuff up, and again, find places where we could stop making so many decisions about things. But what happened, if you look at all 5 of those games, they're essentially the same. Right? The quality level is about the same, with a little bit of randomness thrown in based on the theme ones. And so what we found is that by not giving ourselves time to actually do those postmortems, be thoughtful about what we were doing, we essentially kind of shot ourselves in the foot, because the game at the end of the week was no better than the game at the beginning of the week.
We had 5 games, but we may as well not have.
And if you parallel that to Speedcrafting, the game we made for the first one is, at least in our opinion, certainly less good than the one we made for the last one or the third one. So we were able to grow because we had a week in between each one of those to kind of process together what exactly had just happened. So.
And this is kind of the crux of what we would really like everybody to take away from our side of the talk, which is making games fast is very useful, and it can be very educational, but it's only going to give you what you put into it in terms of how much thought you apply to what happened. So make games quickly, yes, and you'll get a lot out of that, but only if you take the time to examine critically and honestly what went right, what went wrong, and try to turn those into lessons that you're going to apply in the future. All right, that's all we got. Questions, anybody? Yes.
Okay, so what is the difference between juice and not sweating the small stuff? Is the juice kind of some of the smaller?
Juice is always big stuff.
Big stuff.
Yeah. If the juice is small, then it's not juice.
So the idea there is like, the idea is essentially make sure that every piece that you're adding in the game gets completed before you add an additional piece. So if you have spikes in the game, you have a character, which is an example that we saw last week. But as soon as you get platform movement in, and that character can die on that spike, then you had better figure out how to make that the most gruesome, amazing death that anybody's seen.
Even if the
blood
character
is shooting out of the phone at that point.
Even if the character's just a square.
Because the thing is, at that point, if you were to say, like, they just had to turn in the game, it would actually be interesting to play, right? Because suddenly this gruesome death animation should come out of nowhere. So the idea is to kind of actually vertically slice almost every single component as you go, and that includes that sort of juicy element to make sure that it
So I guess another way to think about it would be that we advocate for finishing the game. If you finish every piece of the game as you go, then all of a sudden the whole thing will just be done. You won't need to go back and rework a whole bunch of stuff again, right? So yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this for practice or for profit?
So the Butterscotch Jam, so interestingly, we make all of our games kind of out of game jams, or at least we have until the most recent one. So we would use game jams as kind of a prototyping tool to see which ones are kind of fun. So the 5-day jam was actually built specifically for that reason, was for us to find a core mechanic that we could build on in a very big way, kind of like how Quadric was originally a 7-day roguelike challenge. We did that in 7 days, and then built it out over the course of 9 weeks. And with the Speedcrafting, we had kind of a sub-goal of just seeing what would happen if we actually republished those, right? We wanted to see what would happen if we plugged in ads and IAP in every single one of them. And what happened was not really much, right? There's 2 things that happen there. One is that, of course, the games you make are tiny. And very, very tiny games don't exactly monetize too well. And everybody's going to point to Flappy Bird, but I think we all agree that it's a bit of an outlier as far as how most of these things go. And the other thing that happened is that people basically got bored with us. So the interesting thing is, we release a game every single week. After about like 2 weeks, people are like, okay, it's just another Butterscotch game. You know, people started caring less. I'm not even kidding about this. The interesting thing was we saw a sort of steady drop off, both in our newsletter newsletter activation rate, just in announcing the game, as well as overall download rates as time went on. And another interesting thing is a talk from the Steam Dev Days was talking about Team Fortress 2 and how they patched their game. They used to do a weekly patch, and what they found is that actually started hurting them as far as releasing new content. They found the sort of sweet spot in about 2 months. If you wait 2 months and then release a big patch as opposed to a lot of different tiny patches, people actually like it a lot more, as it turns out, and are much more receptive to that. They don't get burned out. So you end up having a couple of factors kind of fighting against you if you're trying to make money off of a lot of games really fast.
There's also a scarcity principle involved, which is just that people tend to value more things that are scarce. And so if you are making 5 games in 5 days, then all of a sudden the games that come from you are common. And so each game is less valuable to the player. So you do need to be careful about oversaturating your player base by just throwing stuff out there over and over and over again.
But teaching the techniques is what the practice is, and hopefully it leads to profit.
Yeah, eventually, yeah, for sure. I mean, the skills you gain in this, I mean, you're not going to be able to get it as fast doing it anywhere else, right? So it will give you more skills, as Tim was talking about. Like, you're not going to get fame or success, or a profitable kind of success out of it for that particular thing, but as you go, you'll be able to pull all of this content, all this expertise with you, and make something bigger and better at the end, which is what we're experiencing now with our games in development.
So why not release your game every 3 months instead of, I mean, you can make them in 8 hours and you can...
No, absolutely. No, it's extremely smart. I mean, in a lot of ways, it kind of releases a lot of pressure, right? So, 2 months, every 2 months, if you're turning out a game every 2 months, right, you're kind of in a nice cooldown window. And yeah, it would have been nice to know that, but we didn't know at the time. Right? I found that out after the fact.
But at the same time, those smaller games do have they don't really stick as much. You know, when people play them back, oh, that's fun, and they may get hooked on it if you do a good job. They may get hooked on it for a couple days, but after a couple days, they've pretty much seen all the game has to offer, and they're done. If you spend 2 months instead making a big game with lots and lots of systems and tons of content, then people will just play it longer. So, so you have more chances to actually try to
make a game that people can actually come back to a lot. That's where you start seeing actual profitability from it. Like, people pay for stuff that they can actually enjoy.
Right. Yeah.
What have you guys been the most fun style of game to create?
So the most fun style for Speedcrafting.
Most fun to designers.
Yeah, we think, personally I'd say probably arcade. Because it's just so easy. Right? Basically, as soon as you get gravity involved, and touching the ground causes an explosion of some sort, you gotta make it, right? So it takes very, very little energy to do so, and then you can have all kinds of other stuff. So flop rocket is an example from that one. For us, we got to add space worms, space ducks, which are going to call dragons.
They're space ducks.
So yeah, that one for sure. And I think it's just because of the ability to execute on that small thing that's repetitive.
Yeah. So when you guys are rapidly releasing these games, did you provide any, I don't want to say design constraints, because you already said the 1 sentence thing, but how did you choose your themes and stuff like that? Did you do it just randomly?
Kind of random. Well, we had a week to let it marinate, because since we took a week between each game, it was kind of like for me, when we made Flop Rocket as an example, I was playing Kerbal Space Program, as I do, and one day my rocket snapped in half. And yet the top half still remained sitting on top of the engine that was going. So I was trying to steer it while this rocket was like trying to snap in two. And I was like, hey, this is kind of fun. I feel like we can make a game out of this. So it's kind of like, if you know that in a week's time you're just going to sit down and jam out a game, then you'll often just be kind of like much more receptive, and you'll be looking for things to kind of pull in as a possible game experience. So, anybody else? Yeah.
So one of the themes between you guys and Tim is if you make a game short, it's to learn something. If you make a game over a long period of time,
it's going to be more commercially viable.
Yeah, well, you might be making the decision to prioritize money over what you learn. I think that is true, but if you don't have the skills set up from doing that speedcrafting, you're just going to spend a long time to make something that is unsuccessful.
Which is why we would advocate for anybody who hasn't done this kind of rapid game development stuff, do it. Because the skills that you'll get from that and the expertise that you'll acquire will allow you to much more effectively deliver a good product when it comes time to make something that's more on a commercial scale. But yeah, it's not really a good idea if you're very new to game development to try to pull like a Fez and just be like, I'm going to spend 5 years making a game. You know, like it's probably not going to work out. So yeah, don't do that.
Yes.
Anybody else?
Cool. Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thanks guys.